Owen Jones has recently came out with a great expose covering the open letter to the BBC, where the staff of the BBC, I think like 100 journalists and 300 people in total, have sent an open letter signed to BBC, talking and complaining about the BBC's bias, the BBC's pro-Israel bias. So today we'll talk about it. Today we'll talk about the so-called bias of the BBC. We'll bring up some stories from the past. We'll bring up the complaints they are bringing up, and we'll go through Owen Jones's Substack where he did talk about it. He also made a video about it, but that's the article itself is basically just a transcript. So we'll go through that. Joining me today are Anders Ingemarsson, Nicolas Provenzo, and Alejandro. Thank you guys for joining me today. Now, Owen Jones was also on Piers Morgan recently, and there is a one really good clip from the show. Maybe you guys have seen it, and I do want to play this, but before that, I'll go just around the table about what people think about this, if they read the article, and then we'll cover it fully. First, I'll go to you, Alejandro. You haven't been on a show in a while, so it's great to have you back. Yeah, what do you make? And you're the one who is actually I believe you have to pay for BBC license, so or maybe not. So, but yeah, your thoughts on Norman Jones and what he said.
Well, I, I I'm definitely not a fan of Jones, and I think this article is a contradiction in itself. Although I think interestingly enough, I do think he has a point. And the point that I will try to make in this video is that the main issue here is that the conception, the nature, and the objectives of the BBC are wrong in themselves. And the corruption that the nature of the BBC has is from its inception, and there is no way to correct it. The impartiality that it has, this idea that people should have access to the facts and the facts only is impossible, and therefore it's prone to corruption. And therefore, someone like Jones has the capacity and to some extent the right, given the objectives of the BBC, to say, "Hey, I think you are you're not being too much pro Gaza." Um, in essence, I think most of the video I will spend on a critique to the BBC more than Jones itself. Maybe, and just as a comment, I don't like Jones, and I think this letter was so hideous that I looked at who had signed it. Curiously enough, all those people are called anonymous. I don't know why. But then I saw a couple of them that were brave enough to show their names, but probably none of them showed up in Google, so I couldn't boycott them. So anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah, I guess I'll go to you, Nicholas, but I'll add one comment on that. Yeah, this idea of sort of, yeah, unbiased reporting or sort of objective reporting where the word objectivity is corrupted, where I think Ayn Rand has the right conception of objectivity, but what oftentimes people use it normally as sort of, you have no values, you have nothing you're pursuing in life, so that's the way you can actually look at at something so-called objectively when you don't actually have anything to gain, you don't actually have any sort of view you're putting through, which is impossible. You cannot talk about something like war without having some view of it. You cannot talk about it without having sort of ideology that you're putting through. But Nicholas, what are your first comments on this?
Well, I mean, I agree that the letter was nothing to write home about. An anonymous letter doesn't carry much weight. So if people aren't willing to put their names on it, and these are ostensibly professional journalists, how are you supposed to evaluate it then? I mean, who's saying it is important? That's a fact. But to look at the big picture, I absolutely agree. What is journalism? How is journalism helpful for people who are trying to consume news? How do you evaluate the credibility of a journalist or outlet? I think it's interesting. You'll see a lot in debate where someone doesn't agree with your point, and they will just say, well, you're just getting your news from whatever the news source is. And that's supposed to, just squelch further discussion. I've judged you based on your information sources. For myself, I get my information from a lot of different sources. And what's interesting for me is I've really gone out of my way to turn off TV because I just don't like it. I don't find it useful or helpful. I read. And I think doing that helps me process the information, integrate it with other sources that I'm getting. So I might read, 5 or 6 different sources on a subject. Like, for example, a Supreme Court case will come out. I want to hear what the lay of the land thinks of it, what the larger culture thinks of it, just not my, echo chamber, for lack of a better word. The BBC, what does the BBC promise to do? It promises to give you accurate, fair, perceptual level news. Perceptual level news shouldn't be that controversial. If it's X happened and such occurred, so many people did whatever, and this is the credibility that we can give that source. Like the famous one that I think relates to this is Hamas death casualty figures, where they're horrifically overstated, no connection to reality whatsoever, but they're repeatedly treated as credible. And given these incredible claims and the fact they've been so seriously debunked so many times, you would think that any sort of claim would have to be met with a disclaimer saying, in the past, the source has not proven to be reliable. Is that taking a side, or is that being objective? I think the proponent of the anonymous letter thinks that's not being objective, that's being unfair. But I would argue that the dishonesty is a perceptual level fact. And so the dishonesty has to be integrated into the whole. Then you have opinion, where you're, integrating perceptual level facts with a larger philosophic moral view. Do I think that journalists can cabin that off and put the editorial page on the editorial page? Absolutely. And I think, when they do it well, it's often brilliant insight. Even if it's not insight that I agree with, it's at least raising issues that I should be concerned with. So, I think it can be done well. What is the BBC doing? I will agree with the idea that because it's government funded, it's inherently suspect and inherently subject to compromise. And that's the problem with any government funding endeavor. Who's the consumer? Is the consumer the public, or is the consumer the politicians appropriating funds to the media organization? As long as you have that conflict of interest, and I mean, they're not shy about it. I mean, everybody knows the BBC's taxpayer funded, so it's out there for people to analyze and take in. But as soon as that occurs, as soon as you allow it, there's always a question. But there's also a question when you have commercial advertisers. Is the editorial page subject to commercial influence? So there are other questions. So when I guess, long story short, when I look at a media source, can I trust it? Is it giving me the relevant information? Is it conflicting with other stuff that I know to be true? How do I analyze it? How do I frame it? How do I integrate it with everything else that I'm looking at? And would I ever rely on this as my sole source of news? With the BBC, probably not on any of those things. I'd probably be suspect. It's a shame because I remember, when I was in the Marine Corps serving during the first Gulf War, the BBC was something I could pick up on shortwave while I was at sea. And, we weren't getting a whole lot of information on the ship. So it was a useful source of information when I was a young man trying to figure out, where I might be deployed to, or what's going on with that conflict and my potential role in it. So, it has a soft spot in my heart just because of my ability to rely on it when I was a young man. But today, in terms of objective reporting on the conflict in Gaza, I just find it, I don't even look at it anymore because I don't find it useful. And at the same time, it's hard to find useful sources of information. And so, it's tough because I do want to get relevant facts that I can integrate and make decisions. And it's hard to do that. That makes sense.
Yeah, and there is this whole thing about, well, sort of like 2 points that once you actually know a lot about something and then you read a lot of the newspapers, you like see, oh my God, like your office, like you are evading something here, you are really misgoing something here. That's why I hate when people say newspapers lie to you or news lie to you. They would never lie. Like any mainstream newspaper would never lie. That's like an insane sort of like thing to do. But what does happen is not explaining something enough, or basically omitting something, right? Like
Right.
Nicholas, you mentioned the numbers, for example. Like you can say, okay, according to you can according to United Nations humanitarian, I think it's Office for Humanitarian Coordination or something, says 60,000 people died in Gaza. Well, if you don't know anything about it, you see United Nations. Okay, that seems like an objective source, right? It's the United Nations. But then you go look into, okay, where does the UN Humanitarian Affairs Office get its numbers? Oh, they just ask Hamas. They just ask Gaza Health Ministry, and that's all the numbers. They are simply republishing them. So these are Hamas numbers, yet are viewed through, and this is not lying, right?
To
The
treat it
UN
as
office,
authoritative
yeah,
when it's really not. That's the issue. It's treated with a deference that it does not deserve. And
yeah.
again,
But just
that they.
quickly, yeah, I want to go to Anders,
Oh,
and
okay.
then we
Sorry.
can have a full-on conversation since we are just starting. So, Anders, any of your opening thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think an entity like BBC has an impossible charter, just like National Public Radio and PBS in the US and any other state-owned, state-run media organization around the world. Because as you mentioned earlier, yeah, you can strive for a certain level of objectivity, but when we're all part of this, for any media organization that is state-owned and state-controlled, it ends up in what I call it's the tragedy of the public square, if you like. We all have a right, since we're taxpayers and paying. I mean, all of you in Britain, in this case, but the same here in the U.S. And so it becomes a kind of a war of what content should be presented and how to present it. And that's why ultimately what we need to have, and the best solution, is a total separation of state and media and state and news consumption, so that we all have to be critical consumers. And I think the model that most newspapers have, or has had for a long time, where you have an editorial side and you have a news side. And the better newspapers, they kind of keep not a wall of separation, but some separation between the two. And if you consume one of those newspapers, mostly where a particular newspaper stands editorially, right? They're conservative, they're leftist, they are whatever, and you keep that in the back of your head as you consume the news from that side, even though the news side has this, hopefully, if they're good, they're trying to be fact-based. They're trying to be aware of their biases because, as you said, what they publish and what they not publish is ultimately a value judgment, right? So, but that's okay. That's how it works in the marketplace. And if you don't like a particular newspaper, well, then you look for something else. Or these days, go online and look for different Substack newsletters, other people who have podcasts or whatever. And as Nicholas said, you kind of curate your own news consumption, right? Now, we're probably above average in terms of awareness. And that's another thing that I think is dangerous with state-owned media, is that it breeds a complacency, especially for people who are maybe not that active in the news consumption, and they hear that if it's PBS, NPR, or BBC in this case, they're supposed to be, they're objective. And they kind of shut down to some extent in their criticism and consume it uncritically. And I think that is dangerous. And that happens in every area where, where there is a government taking over. You can go through society from healthcare to retirement and everything. And wherever the government takes over, and a large portion of the populace, they kind of think this is how it is, and kind of relax in their own thinking and stop being critical consumers of whatever it is. And I definitely think we see that and have seen that over many decades in media. It has gotten better. That's my opinion, because of first we had the cable landscape developing in the 80s and 90s. And since the internet, and now with all these online sources, yes, it can certainly be overwhelming. But man, it's a better landscape today than what it was when we were dependent here in the US on our three main channels. In the UK, you had BBC. My native Sweden had 2 TV channels for the most part of my upbringing. Nowadays they have access to the world as well. So we're, I would argue, in a much better spot, regardless of how much we may dislike what, in this particular case, the journalists at BBC have published in this letter, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I want to go into what Owen Jones talked about, but first I can bring up one thing from my own country. So in Slovakia, we had a state media after the fall of communism, but that state media was used as a government propaganda, which led to an interesting situation where a commercial TV actually took away that idea of being a state media, basically providing so-called objective reporting, not just being propaganda. And until recently, when now that commercial media is slipping back into basically just being state propaganda. But for a long time, actually, the commercial media was that sort of provider of what we would call objective reporting, which I think is
but
interesting.
May I then ask you, do you have other sources coming up in response to this? New channels created that are trying to take over that role that other commercial channels did in the past, or?
Not when it comes to actual cable TV, but that's already falling apart. So actually, one of the biggest reporter from that commercial TV, who was fired because he refused to simply spread propaganda for the state media, actually founded his own basically media subscription model. So yeah, it's
there you go. And I mean, but 50 years ago he couldn't have done that, regardless of the fact that there was an iron curtain. But in any country, I mean, 50 years ago you couldn't have done it in Sweden, you couldn't have done it in the US, and gotten the reach that you can do today if you're good.
Yeah, so let's read a bit from Owen Jones. So this is from his Substack. The article is called BBC Staff We're Forced to Do Pro-Israel PR. He goes, a devastating letter signed by over 100 BBC journalists underline one of the great scandals of our age. Now, as you guys mentioned earlier, these 100 journalists are all anonymous. They are few, so there's 100 journalists who are all anonymous. Somebody said in the chat, not everybody is from BBC Arabic. There are some, but there are also many from normal BBC, as well as executive producers and people in sort of high-end positions. But like I said, all of them are anonymous. There's about 300 more people who have nothing to do with BBC. Some of them are anonymous, some of them are open, but as Alejandro said, I haven't heard of any of them before. Although Owen Jones is actually also signed there, so there you go. Owen Jones continues, this is a devastating intervention. More than 100 BBC employees have written a letter to the Director General, Tim Davie, complaining that the corporation has become a mouthpiece for Israel. It was also signed by 300 other journalists and media professionals. One of them was yours truly. The BBC employees, as you would expect, are all anonymous because otherwise they would face great consequences to their careers. The letter says, we are writing to express our concerns over opaque editorial decisions and censorship at the BBC on the reporting of Israel-Palestine. We believe the refusal to broadcast the documentary Gaza, Medics Under Fire is just one in a long line of agenda-driven decisions. It demonstrates once again that the BBC is not reporting without fear or favor when it comes to Israel. It goes on to note that the decision not to broadcast the investigation was taken by BBC management despite the content being signed off in accordance with BBC guidelines and editorial policy, which it says appears to be a political decision, adding that the BBC response shows the organization is crippled by the fear of being perceived as critical of the Israeli government. Now, we could go into some of the past many things we talked from BBC, showing that no, they are not critical or afraid to criticize the Israeli government. But if I can, I'll go to you, Alejandro, but I can just quickly bring up specifically the Gaza Medics Under Fire documentary. So again, that was pulled, but here is the fact. We know the medical staff in Gaza has been, what's the right word, in cahoots with Hamas. We know hospitals have been used by Hamas. We know the medical staff in Gaza has coordinated with Hamas. Hostages were held in hospitals. There are tunnels under hospitals. Again, this cannot happen without nobody in the medical industry in Gaza knowing about it. Not to mention no whistleblowers in Gaza coming out, nothing about that. So yeah, just context for that. And Alejandro, what do you make of this part?
Well, here in the first part of the Substack, he's trying to claim that his promise is going to be, I'm going to show you that there is a long list of ways in which the BBC has silenced pro-Palestinian discourse because it was too damaging of Israel. And granted, it would appear that he's trying to make that point. But then if you just scratch a bit his argument, this documentary isn't being banned from the BBC, or it isn't being published from BBC because it's talking wrongly about Israel. It's being banned because it was found out that some people involved in the documentary were directly linked to Hamas, aside of all other things that we have talked about in this channel. It isn't like the whole aura and the whole thing that is being said in the documentary is too antagonistic to the impartiality rule of the BBC, which would have proven to have been slanted in favor of Hamas. Now, again, is that objectionable to someone? Yes, I think it's objectionable for the BBC to say to be valueless. In reality, they're setting up a certain type of values over here. But certainly, I don't think that the point that he's trying to make lands or is plausible.
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. A super chat from Equal to Reality, who sends 17 pounds and 76 cents. Thank you so much. He says, on a more pleasant note, happy 4th of July to my American at heart friends. Thank you so much. Happy 4th of July. And also a super chat from Nicholas, who sends $17.76, continuing the tradition of Jonathan from 3 days ago, who also donated while being on the show. So I'm happy.
Well, Equal to Reality inspired me, so I was going to match him with American dollars. Probably not worth as much. I'm sorry, but thanks so much.
But going to you, Nicholas, what do you make of this first part?
Well, I mean, I think the letter itself is really bad. I mean, they're throwing around terms like genocide, and again, flippantly, they don't mention the word Hamas, which is telling. Where are my notes? Yeah, it's the idea. They clearly frame the Palestine cause as the victim and Israel as the aggressor. So what is this letter really? It's someone who's disgruntled with the fact that either the BBC's framing is neutral or sympathetic to Israel. I would have a hard time not being sympathetic to Israel if I was tasked with the job of reporting on the issue. But at the same time, you're a professional. And what are you trying to give? Relevant facts so that people can make informed judgments. The credibility of information sources would be huge on my mind. So, again, when the Gaza Health Ministry lies about casualty numbers, that would be a line in the story. And this source has proven to be reliable repeatedly in the past, or words to that effect. It's interesting how leftists manifest their discontent, and I think that's what's happening here. He doesn't. I mean, how if he saw the conflict as being portrayed unfairly, you'd think that would be a article in and of itself. How do you portray a conflict fairly? How would you do it? What would be the standards by which you judge? Is it to be the mouthpiece for the Palestinians if he feels that the BBC is being the mouthpiece for the Israelis? I mean, he doesn't really lay that out. It'd be interesting to see what he would prefer the reporting to look like. I think it's one of those things where they like to impose their normative view on the world, but they don't wish to be open about it. They just wish to make it like an assumed fact. And I'll give you an example. When you look at my experiences, like colleges when they're running their DEI programs, there's not even like a discussion of another worldview. It's just like we have this whole very intricate ideology, and we're imposing it now, and there shall be no dissent. And that's often what I see news media types wishing they could do. And that fails because there's no market for it, and fails because there are, in fact, relevant facts that are being excluded, and people resent that. And again, yeah, I don't see his solution as any better. I see it significantly worse than what he's criticizing. So the letter's a mess on several different levels. I think it's interesting. I think Schott said 10 stations can lie just as easily as 2. That's true. And I see that a lot more on Twitter. Like, you'll get these random Twitter feeds espousing a view. And the ones that I get are usually a pro-MAGA view. And I'm like, I've never heard of this person before. I don't know why it's showing up on my feed. I don't know what Elon Musk has done to the algorithm to make it so, but now I'm reading it. So I've just wasted an iota of my mental bandwidth on this message. And I'm trying to analyze, is this a bot? Because my concern, especially with Twitter, is how easy it is for bad actors to basically use Twitter as or acts as a propaganda tool. And, so people have an interest in fomenting dissent in America can broadcast on Twitter and create how many unknown, fake accounts to put out a message that then tweaks the algorithm that slants things to and fro. And I think you see that with the Russians. I think you see that with the Chinese. I've heard that the Iranians have been doing it. And that compromises the quality information tool dramatically. Because if I'm sitting there having to analyze whether or not this is even a thing, if this is legitimate, is this reflecting a groundswell or just a state actor trying to gum up the works, the whole information system breaks down. So there, it's not just a question of 10 stations, it's a question of 10,000. Can you believe 10,000 Twitter accounts condemning something one way or the other? Probably not. And so, I agree with Anders in that there's an opportunity to publish that we've never had before. So if I'm upset about something, or I have some insight that I want to communicate to the world, I have the ability to publish without having to go through a third party. That's incredible. But so does everybody else. And a lot of that content is garbage. And so I guess, who was the guy who wrote the book, An Army of Davids? And it was, what was his name? Glenn Reynolds, the Instapundit blogger, a law professor. I think he's University of Tennessee. And his argument was that blogging and the internet have changed things. And now we no longer have to rely upon big media because anybody can speak. And anybody with expertise can speak. And in that exchange of ideas, these voices will rise. And yes, I think there's an element of truth to that, but I don't think that argument foresaw the massive amount of propaganda that we get. And that's something that actually shocks me, is that no one's really discussing propaganda in our modern age. It's like some relic of the 30s or something, the Goebbels era. But I think there's probably more propaganda, bad propaganda, put out today than there has ever been in human history. And I think it's important to develop tools to sift through that and dispose of it as it deserves to be disposed of. And I don't see that discussion. I think objectivists are better at sifting through propaganda, but I definitely can see where there are a lot of objectivists who have fallen prey, and you can see it in the way that they argue, and you can see what they argue about. And so I do think it's a problem, and I think it can even overwhelm a good philosophy if you're not attuned to it.
Yeah, and I want to go to you, Anders, but just a quick word on propaganda. Something to remember about it is that propaganda doesn't equal lies. Propaganda means you are taking some things that are facts, and oftentimes you're trying to put it as like this is the main issue. And one thing I've noticed it the most is about Ukraine and specifically the Azov battalion. People who go on and on to try to label all of Ukraine as basically this like neo-Nazi empire that Russia is just coming in, and this is part of Russian propaganda, right? It's labeling all of Ukrainians as Nazis to justify the invasion. So again, you can take something that is sort of true, meaning parts of the sort of original Azov battalion had some neo-Nazi connections, and to use that to label all of Ukrainian military as basically this sort of like neo-Nazi bastion, or to overemphasize, let's say, corruption in Ukraine to make it as like, okay, this is the problem. Or, even talk about going into Gaza, right? Even talking about something like how many Palestinians have died, ignoring the fact that this is a war, sort of like overemphasizing. And that's why I think sort of like having a proper philosophy, having an actual view of sort of the world is important, right? Because if you just deal with factoids, if you just deal with, okay, this many people died and this many people died on this side, and that goes to the idea of objective reporting, Nicholas, you earlier talked about, right? Like, how can you provide objective reporting to something like war unless you have a certain view? Like, what is objective? Both sides are good or both sides are equal, and you go from that regard, and that is the way to be objective? Or is it you actually have a certain view, you actually have the idea that somebody is good here, and then we can actually talk about the specific actions that either sides are taking? Anders, any comments from you on either the sort of what Owen Jones has been talking about or some of the things we have mentioned?
The latter. It's what you just said. I mean, it's objectivity in media. I mean, I agree with you. It has to be based on an objective philosophy, but it's also difficult, and I think it's just inherently messy, because of what you choose to publish, what you choose to write, what you choose not to write. Of course, it's influenced by your ideas and whether those ideas are right or wrong. That's just what it is, and that is why being a critical consumer is important if it's important to you. And I agree with Nicholas that X or Twitter is it's a challenging format, and quite frankly, I don't really spend any time on X partly for that reason. And you bet that the executive of X are concerned with this, and they're working or trying to figure out a way, because if people leave X because they think it's mainly propaganda or bots or whatever, well, then they will lose their advertisers. And so this is a part of their survival. And the same thing applies to every media outlet. So in this case, with this BBC and this letter, so I was just thinking, is it because of its charter and this notion of being not objective, but impartial, which I think is impossible. I mean, is it the charter that gave rise to the letter? Because if you take any private media corporation, and we've had examples of this recently in the US, I think the employees at the Wall Street Journal, on the news side of the Wall Street Journal, they wrote a letter or voiced their concern about the editorial side. And, I'm sure they had very heated discussions internally, but some of it got out. And basically, if I remember correctly, the publisher just shut it down and said, nope, this is what we're doing, and this is what our editorial page is doing. And okay, so the people on the news side who were totally unhappy with that, well, what do? Well, I assume they would contact New York Times. Maybe they have a job that more meets what their expectations are for the reporting and for what the editorial page should be like. Now, I don't know about people at BBC. Are people leaving BBC, going to The Guardian, for instance, if they're not happy with what the BBC is doing? Or are they so protected by their unions and stuffs that they are sitting there and are just miserable day in and day out because they have a nice little package that they don't want to lose, and so on and so forth? I don't know, but I mean, ultimately, the solution, what you would do in a rational capitalist society here, and is that you would have total separation of state and media. And how do you get from here to there? Well, in the case of a BBC, for instance, you could, privatize the corporation, give every British taxpayer a share, and then however much money the British government is providing to BBC today, and I have no idea what that is, but just gradually step it down over 10 years or something like that. Everybody has a plan. And if you don't want to be involved, you sell your share. If BBC is really important to you, you get together with your fellow shareholders and try to influence it in whatever direction you want it to take. But I mean, that's the fact that it is a state-owned media, I think, is very much the source of the problem that is creating these conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to, I think like a really important point is the fact that if you do any reporting, like there is no way to be impartial. You have to make a value judgment, right? Am I going to write about this, or am I going to write something else? You cannot have infinite amount of journalists covering every single thing that is happening on the earth and providing it some form of, factual or providing it the factual context, right? Like at some point you need to choose, okay, do we want to cover now Israeli Palestinian conflict? Do you want to cover Ukrainian? Now you can do multiple things at one time, but there's only so much you can do. At some point you have to, like ARCUK, right? What do we want to cover? We have 2 shows a day, or normally we have 2 shows a day. For a bit, we have 1 show a day. We have to choose what are we going to cover. Now, after October 7, we decided that it's important to cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because of how much bad ideology is out there and because nobody is providing the right view of the conflict, right? So we are filling in the market hole. But that means that there are things happening that we cannot cover. Are we being not objective about it? Or are we being objective because we are focusing about the things that at least we think matter the most? Before we continue a bit further, let me remind people to sign up for our newsletter. We have many live events. We are planning to do a lot of stuff later into the year. So make sure to sign up for our newsletter so you know everything that is happening both around the shows, around live events, and you never miss anything. As well as if people are interested, we recently had an interview with Zoltan Sendes, the writer of the Objectivist Guide to the Galaxy. If you are an objectivist, or even if you are not an objectivist, if you're interested in science, you can check out his book on Amazon. Link to that is in the chat. I believe it's still on sale on Kindle for just $1, so You can get it for really cheap now. You can also get a paperback and a hardback, and you can find out more about sort of the objectivist view of science by Zoltan Sendes. It's also written, you might get the reference, it's written, it was inspired by the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So that's why in the book itself, I believe it either has 42 chapters or it has 42 sort of questions he is trying to answer, which people might know from the book. 42 is the answer to life, and I think it's something like life and everything on earth or something like that is the full line. So yeah, link to that, link to Amazon is in the chat and in the description. You can check it out. I'm wondering if we should read a bit. Okay, let's read a bit more from Owen Jones just to have it, and then I'll go to you, Alejandro, again. So he continues. This is a letter which passed every single BBC internal check. No factual errors are alleged. The only other BBC documentary which focused on the apocalyptic plight of the Palestinian people in Gaza was taken down as a result of a hysterical pro-Israel campaign, because the father of the child's narrator's son had a junior technocratic position in the Hamas administration. Irrelevant, given the narrator's words were written for him by the documentary producers. The letter emphasizes that the signatories are... okay, let's cover just the first part. I love how he like phases over that. Okay, yeah. Somebody working on the documentary has ties to a terrorist organization, but you know, it's just a small technocratic position. You know, it's like Al-Jilani. He only joined Al-Qaeda because he needed experience. He wasn't, you know, there just was nowhere else to go. It's a ridiculous way to talk about it. The fact is, this is what the BBC's impartiality guidelines are supposed to cover for, to make sure either that the views of terrorists are not shown on this television. Yeah. I mean, Alejandro, what can you even say when somebody is so brazen in like ignoring this fact? Like, this is not even him like evading this. He is openly stating it and saying this is not a problem.
I agree. And first and foremost, let me correct myself something. I said that the medics from Gaza, the one that we were talking about, had not been released because of the conflict of interest of some narrator being related to Gaza. It was this documentary which you're mentioning about. Sorry for the confusion to the audience, but I think it makes sense, and I think there is I think Jones is not an honest person, because in the same article he goes around to talk about someone else. I don't remember his last name, Robbie Gibb, and he says that because he's a brother of a Tory minister, he has some clear agenda and so on. So he's admitting, on the one hand, he's saying, hey, relationships don't matter, and then, oh yeah, he's a brother of someone, and therefore he must be like this nefarious person. Again, I wouldn't be surprised that there is some slant over here, and that the BBC isn't really committed to impartiality. In my view, it's not committed to impartiality because it gives voice to people who shouldn't be receiving a voice. But true. I think one, I don't think that Jones is an honest person, and second of all, again, the BBC has much of the blame for this, because if it didn't have the impartiality device, it wouldn't open the gates to people who claim, hey, this kind of voice should be heard as well.
Yeah, and since you mentioned that sort of that Owen Jones is not an honest person, let's actually watch the clip I wanted to do earlier. This is from his recent appearance on Piers Morgan.
When people say the NHS will die, literally they will say the NHS will die without reform, are they saying that they're going to be the mass murder of doctors and patients?
So to be clear, when you watch that rapper, at Glastonbury chanting and leading a chant with thousands joining in of death to the IDF, you instinctively believe...
He said it himself. He said...
Oh, no, he said it since. So you accept then that the rapper was talking about soldiers?
No, people call for the death of the Russian army all the time.
Do you believe him 100%?
Yes.
That when he said death to the IDF, he didn't mean individuals? Do you believe that?
Well, he's actually, unlike... I mean, this is the irony. Do you know what the irony is?
Well, just answer my question first.
Yes, I do.
Because new footage has emerged.
And death to every single IDF soldier out there as an agent of terror.
I've known you a long time. I have a lot of respect for you. You just have to admit, when you hear that, you were wrong to defend him in the way you defended him. He didn't mean IDF.
People I was defending...
He didn't mean IDF the entity. He did it. But you accept now that you were wrong. He didn't mean that.
We both... I didn't hear... I've only heard for the first time.
You've heard that. So what? Now you've heard that. Do you still say he only meant the entity?
Well, no, obviously now he's made clear what he meant
So you
by
accept
that.
you were wrong?
Well, yeah, because I obviously...
I know. I'm not saying you should have known.
Fine.
I'm just saying that I found the defence very disingenuous by everybody. And I felt what he'd done, and this has now been proven, I think. He'd gone on social media. He'd seen people coming up with this ludicrous defence, but he only meant the entity. And then, and knowing what he'd said on stage, he issues a statement saying the complete opposite that he's read from people like you defending it. And now he's made all of you look like complete prunes.
No.
All right, so yeah, I don't like Piers Morgan, but this was kind of fun.
I gotta go for a walk now. I take a nap or something. It's so bad.
Yeah, so this was from recent. We talked about it on Monday. This is, of course, from Glastonbury, where the singer Bob Dylan started chanting "death to the IDF." Now, for some reason, all the communists around are coming around to defend that statement for some reason. Well, we know what the reason is, because they are anti-Israeli, because many of them are anti-Semitic, so they would defend this statement. But yeah, he started chanting that. Owen Jones tried to defend it. Oh, he's just talking broadly about the state of Israel, or sort of the state of the Zionist regime. He's not talking about, and yeah, then the pavilion goes on, death to every single soldier, which again practically means every single Israeli, since Israel has mandatory service, and pretty much everybody has actually served in the IDF. Yeah, Nicholas, any comments on this? Or the earlier statement?
Well, so Morgan is trying to confront Owens with, are you honest? Are you willing to change your mind in the face of facts? And the guy's stuttering all over it, and it becomes, I just call it chum, where you're just, it's a kind of stupid argument. You're not getting to the heart of what the person believes and why they believe it. I'd be more interested, I like the more thoughtful interviews where it's not an argument, but putting good questions, tough questions. So I would have, if it would have been me interviewing Owens, I would have played the clip and then said, how do you reconcile this? Show me how you reconcile this. And then let him talk instead of interrupting him. And if it's dishonest, you can identify the dishonesty. But it's a slower, more thoughtful, engaging process where you're trying to, I'll give you an example. A lot of times when you have a public speaking event, people will line up in the queue, and what they really want to do is they want to lecture to the speaker and tell them how they're wrong. Well, yes and no. I like to ask questions. What's the toughest question I could ask this person? And the most revealing question. And my favorite was Ralph Nader was a guest at my undergraduate school, George Mason. And I got a chance to ask, what's the toughest question I actually asked Ralph Nader? Given what he was talking about, it was DDT, the DDT ban, because he was talking in defense of environmentalism. And I go, well, how do you weigh the consequence of the DDT ban, which is, been pretty reliably shown to be increased death as a result of malaria infection? And you could see he brushed it off. There's technology that'll solve this problem, not a problem. But it's revealing, because then you see how someone, when they're confronted with an unpleasant outcome of their worldview, whether they honestly deal with it or dishonestly deal with it. It's hard to deal with it honestly, even if you're an objectivist, because no one likes to be shown they're wrong. And it's difficult to immediately, change gears. Oh, you've given me this fact in the middle of a public forum that's devastated my worldview. I'm going to change right here. Nobody does that. They do it off page. They do it when you can't see them. But you can at least get a hint of their process. How honest are they? How, reasonably do they think? And so, what Morgan could have done, but I think it's beyond him, and it's beyond TV that's driven based on engagement and not thought, is ask him the difficult questions. And the difficult question is, how do you square the way Hamas fights with your claim that Israel is in the wrong? We've all seen the footage of how Hamas fights, and most of us are horrified by it. How do you look at that and turn around and defend Hamas? Explain it to me like I'm an idiot, because I don't see it. And that would be interesting. And I would say that, you'd be, swayed or bowled over by Owen's answer, but at least you'd see him attempt to justify his position, see if he could, and then realize, is this position garbage, or is there something to it? Even if I don't agree with it, is there something to it that I need to take into account, if only to counter it? And I think, that's why, again, I don't watch TV, because I just I don't find that illuminating. I'd much rather read a thoughtful piece that explains someone's worldview and analyze that than have to, sort through, chum buckets thrown on the screen.
Yeah, and well, I guess you don't know that much about Owen Jones. I think with some people, especially when you know they are dishonest, there is no way to honestly engage with that, right? It reminds me of the interview of Bassem Youssef. I think it was also on Piers Morgan, where Piers Morgan asked him, well, what would you do in Israeli situation, after October 7, this happened, what would you do? And he basically said, no, I would genocide Palestinians. He was sort of like trying to make fun of Israel, and he conducted his whole interview like that, basically never offering an actual solution, always simply making fun of like the whole situation. And I think Owen Jones is in a very similar state. There is no way to honestly engage.
Then you have to ask why, exactly. Then you have to ask, why is our culture giving him currency that he does not deserve? I find that all the time. Like, the one I was thinking of today was Laura Loomer. Why is she a thing? Why is this Owen gentleman a thing? That's the question. Why is he even working at the BBC? It seems like he's got a lot of problems himself.
Well, he's not on BBC.
Okay,
he writes for The Guardian sometimes.
Okay. Why? I mean, just looking at him, he seems like a young guy. He seems like a hothead. He seems like he's ideologically driven. He doesn't seem particularly thoughtful. He doesn't seem particularly elegant or articulate. If you read the letter, I wasn't particularly swayed by it in any shape. Even as a rhetorical device, absent its ideological content. So why is he a thing?
I guess a good question. Good question for you, Anders. Why are people like Owen Jones a thing? Why is there sort of like such a need for? I mean, there is no honesty coming from Owen Jones. He's like a straight up communist. He's a straight up propagandist. I mean, it's when it comes to dealing with honesty with Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the fact is that I don't think you can like find an honest person on the Palestinian side. It's like trying to find for an honest person on the Nazi side during World War II. I mean, what justification can there be? What can you find? So this is one of the conflicts where if somebody is fully on the Palestinian side, it's almost automatic dishonesty unless they are really uninformed. Anders?
Yeah, I think he's. I don't know how big his subscriber base is for his Substack, but I suspect that he's.
His YouTube is 800,000 subscribers.
Yeah, I'm sure he fills a function in that he is providing confirmation to people who are looking for his view, confirmation of their own views, and here is someone who is supposedly then a low-grade celebrity, maybe. I don't know what you classify him as, but there is probably we know there's a large echo chamber of pro-Palestinians, anti-Israel people, and he's just part of that that ecosystem, and that's what he's feeding off, and providing information. I mean, when I listen to him, I mean, it's almost laughable. He's not very articulate. He is, and his writing is very hyperbolic, over the top. So there has to be some kind of audience for this. And why is he a thing? Well, you can go deeper here, obviously, and say that, well, it's the political climate, it's the moral climate, it's the philosophy underlying all of this. That is what gives rise to people like Owen Jones.
Yeah, and with that, I guess we are running out of time. So I know Nicholas, before the show, mentioned he might have a few words about the fact that it's the Independence Day, but I'll ask all of you, since I'm sure all of you have something to say. So Alejandro, first, any last thoughts on this topic, and then anything you'd like to say on the Independence Day?
Well, happy Independence Day. And one of the ways in which the UK could become more independently minded is to abolish the BBC, so that we can have more independence of thought. And happy 4th of July to everyone that it's celebrating.
And what can people find you or follow you?
Well, I think the thing that I usually sell here is the Ayn Rand essays that I did with James Valiant. It's a playlist in this very same channel. If you're interested into Ayn Rand, you want to chew her essays, I think that's a great lead over there.
Nicholas, any last thoughts from you on this topic and anything on 4th of July?
I just want to wish everyone an awesome Independence Day. I think it's a little bit tough in America right now to feel the normal celebratory feelings that we might have. I certainly feel a little bit squelched myself, but I also look at it like this. I'm trying to, and the people that the guests on this show are trying to live that spirit and personify it today. That spirit of independence, that spirit of thoughtful, principled action that led to the greatest expansion of freedom in human history. And so I'm definitely proud to be a part of that. Thanks so much for having me as a guest today, and thanks to the other panelists. You can find me on Substack, and yeah. Happy Independence Day. Thanks so much.
Anders, what about you? Last thoughts, and what about
Happy Independence Day from an American by choice who happened to be born in the wrong country. And I know that you are also Americans in mind that unfortunately are in the wrong country. But hey, we're all fighting the good fight. And you can find me on Substack, andersingemarsson.substack.com. My most recent article is named Independence Day, The True No King's Day. So please check that out. My book is available on Amazon.
And you'll be able to find all of the links to everybody in the description, as well as, let me remind people again to sign up for our newsletter. If you are interested in any events we do, we announce everything on our newsletter, so make sure to join that, as well as the Objectivist Guide to the Galaxy. If you are an objectivist who is interested in science, or the other way around, a scientist who is interested in objectivism, or even if you are neither of those and just interested in both science and objectivism, you can check out the new book from Zoltan Sendes, The Objectivist Guide to the Galaxy. The link to that is in the chat, and it's going to be in the description. With that, thank you guys for joining me today. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow with another episode of the Daily Objective. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.